next day there was a wedding celebration in the village of Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration. The wine supply ran out during the festivities, so Jesus' mother told him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, that's not our problem," Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." But his mother told the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Standing nearby were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each could hold 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus told the servants, "Fill the jars with water." When the jars had been filled, he said, "Now dip some out and take it to the master of ceremonies." So the servants followed his instructions. When the master of ceremonies tasted the water that was now wine, not knowing where it had come from, though of course the servants knew, he called the bridegroom over. "A host always serves the best wine first," he said. "Then when everyone has had a lot to drink, he brings out the less expensive. But you have kept the best until now." This miraculous sign in Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After the wedding, he went to Capernaum for a few days with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples.
Hey, if you haven't been here, we're in part 2 of a 4-part story. So every year, the church tells the story about Jesus in 4 parts. Advent, Epiphany, Lent, and Easter. And the reason the church does this year after year after year is to root or anchor your life in Jesus' life. So from the perspective of the church, being human is kind of a mystery, right? We don't really get it. The world we live in isn't going to tell us the truth about what it means to be human. At worst, it's going to actively lie to us. If you really want to know what being human is about, the church would say, reflect on the life of Jesus. That the fullness of humanity is found in Christ. There's a Catholic encyclical entitled Gaudium et Spes. It means hope and joy. And in it, it says that it's only in the mystery of the Word made flesh, right? Jesus, the mystery of the Word made flesh, that the mystery of being human becomes clear. So every year, the church tells a story about Jesus in order to root your life in his life. So season 1's Advent, where we reflect on his birth. We are now in part 2. This is the season of Epiphany, where we are reflecting on Jesus' life. Right? That kind of the orthodox way to understand this is that God doesn't become human in Jesus. God takes on flesh in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. God must already be human, or the fullness of humanity in God's self. For you to be made in God's image, whatever it means for you to be human, that has to be rooted in what is already in God. God is the fullness of humanity. That fullness takes on flesh, or is embodied in the person Jesus of Nazareth. So in Jesus, we're seeing the full human, the true human, the perfect human, or what I've called the archetypal man in flesh and blood. And it's through his, not just his death and his resurrection, but it's through his life, right? The way we would say this is that God became what we are, flesh and blood, that we might become what he is, which is fully human. Right, that God comes in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, birth, life, death, and resurrection, to somehow make it possible for us to be who we are supposed to be, to carry us up into the fullness of what it means to be human. So in this series, we're reflecting on Jesus' flesh and blood human life. How does his flesh and blood humanity function to carry us up into our fullness of humanity? So we've looked at, or what I'm trying to do in this series is look at each stage, because I just think this is a fun, provocative way to do it, is look at the different stages of Jesus' flesh and blood life and talk about that in our own experience, right? So we've looked at Jesus' early years, kind of birth through 3, 4. Last week we looked at the middle years, kind of 4 through 12. Today I want to talk about adolescence, right? Those wonderful teenage years. As some of you are in those years right now, so this message will be particularly appropriate for you. Those of us who are beyond these years, we look back on them with a mixture of fondness and horror, right? We all have some low-grade PTSD, not because we served in the military, but because we were teenagers once, okay? So we've all been there, okay? Adolescence. The word adolescence means to mature. So adolescence is a season of maturation. It is the period of years where we are moving from childhood into adulthood. Now, we know when adolescence begins. Begins the same for everybody in every culture all over the world. Adolescence begins with puberty, right? Those changes in our body signal to the rest of the world, you're not a kid anymore. You're moving beyond childhood, and you're on your way to whatever it means to be an adult. So we know when adolescence begins. The question is, when does it end? When do you know that you've become an adult? Or some of you are like, it never happens. I've been married to him for 50 years. It never will come, ever. Okay? When does adolescence end? When do you become an adult? Now, there's tons of research and tons of social commentary on adolescence sprawling in our own culture, and right, people are starting it earlier and they're ending it later or whatever. When does it end? We know when you begin to transition out of childhood toward adulthood. When do you become an adult? Well, it depends on how you define adulthood. Right? What does it mean to be an adult? I think every culture has a legal definition. I mean, you kind of have to. I mean, for us to live together out in the world and work together and, drive our cars and things, you have to, at some point, you have to draw a line in the sand and say, okay, we're now treating you as a legal adult. We're going to hold you responsible for obeying the laws. Every culture has a legal definition. For us, it's 18 for most things, 21 for some. In ancient Israel, this was also the case, as I assume it is the case everywhere. In ancient Israel, you began your legal capacity at puberty. Around 12 or 13, Israelite boys and girls were expected to start carrying a little more of the load of kind of moral responsibility for their religious law. The most glaring example that I can think of where you're like, okay, you didn't have to and now you have to, is in Jewish religious law. If you were a man and you were married and you died before your wife conceived a child, specifically a male heir, in Jewish law, if you had a brother, your widow was supposed to marry your brother and have a child for you to carry on your name in the tribe. Okay, well, if you're a prepubescent boy, for obvious reasons, you can't fulfill that law. If you're a pubescent boy, you can, and you were expected to. So there was a move, right, where you started, your tribe, your society began to expect, we're going to ask you to be responsible, a little more legally responsible than you were a year ago or 2 years ago. Now, they didn't expect people, as we don't, and we'll talk more about why in just a minute, we didn't expect them to take full legal responsibility. That was a process. So they started becoming legal adults at 12, 13 with the onset of puberty, but they didn't become full legal adults until they were 20. 20 was the age that you had to start paying the half shekel temple tax on your own. Like your parents weren't paying for that anymore, right? They're not paying your car insurance anymore. It's your responsibility. Okay, you got to do it. Okay, 20 was the age for that. 20 was the age when you were counted in the census. If you were a male, 20 was the age where you could be drafted in the military. If you were a male Levite, 20 was the age when you started performing your services in the temple alongside the priesthood. Okay, there's some text that would suggest it was a little older, 25 or 30, but the consensus is that it was 20. Most importantly, though, 20 seems to be, and there are a number of narratives that suggest this, 20 was the age when you were held morally responsible for obeying God. Basically for obeying the full religious law, and you were punishable if you didn't. One of the best examples of this is in Numbers 14. If you don't know this story, God rescues the Hebrew slaves from Egypt, where they had been for 400 years. They travel through the Sinai desert wilderness, and they find themselves on the edge of what the scriptures call the promised land, this land God promised to give them. And they're in the wilderness of Paran. And God says, okay, folks, time to go in and occupy the land that I promised to give you. And of course, they're all like, hey, I'm not sure that's a great idea. We should at least maybe scope this out first, before we just go running in there. So they elect 12 spies, right? One leader from each tribe, and they put a spy group together. Okay, you guys go in there, check it out, come back, let us know how things are. So these 12 spies, they go in, they scout the land out, they come back. Two of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, are like, this place is great. Like, this is way better than even Moses said it was. The grapes are like as big as your head. We should definitely go do this. Come on, guys, let's do it. And the other 10 are like, yeah, look, what they failed to mention is that there are also very large, scary people who live there, and we should definitely not try to take their land. That would be a bad idea. And as you can imagine, as I probably would, and you probably would if you're being honest, most of us are more motivated by the fear of losing what we have than we are at the prospect of gaining something new. So when you're presented with two reports, hey, there's a lot of potential in there, or you're going to die, most of us are going to listen to the I don't want to die, okay? And so everybody's like, no, we're not doing that, and they rebel against God, and they won't go in. And the story says that God holds everyone 20 years of age and older accountable for the rebellion. So God specifically punishes everybody 20 years of age and older. They spend the next 40 years of their lives walking in circles in the desert until every single one of them is dead. But that means he doesn't hold accountable the 19-year-olds or the 18-year-olds or the 17-year-olds who surely participated in the rebellion, right? I mean, you're telling me that there wasn't an 18-year-old in the crowd going, yeah, I'm not going in there. I'm not going in there. I don't care what God says. I'm not going, those people are big. I'm not going in there. I'm sure there was, but God doesn't hold that person responsible the same way that God holds the 20-year-old responsible, okay? So there's a lot of evidence in the scriptures to suggest that for the Israelites, full legal adulthood was 20. For us, it's 18 to 21. So we're right in the same ballpark. I think a lot of cultures, it's about this age. Why is that? Why do we not hold 13-year-olds fully legally responsible, but we do start holding 20-year-olds fully legally responsible? Well, to suggest, if you fast forward 40 years from this whole, in the wilderness of Paran, spies and scouts incident, okay, 40 years has gone by. All the people who were 20 years of age and older, they're all dead now. Their children, who now would range in age from 40 to 59, and their kids and potential grandkids are now back on the edge of the promised land. So this is now your second chance. This time they're east of the Jordan River, near the city of Jericho. And Moses, before they go back and try this again, Moses decides to give a big, long speech. It's basically the whole book of Deuteronomy. And so Moses starts the speech by saying, hey, let's just remember where we've been, guys, so we don't make the same mistakes, because you don't want to end up dead like all of your ancestors. Okay? So he recounts the story. And when he tells the story of the spies and the wilderness of Paran, and remember, they rebelled and they didn't go in, the way he explains it, he says the reason God didn't hold you responsible was because you didn't yet know good from evil. So it gives you this window, and you all know this. This should be intuitive. We don't hold 13-year-olds fully legally responsible the way we hold a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old, because they're not morally mature yet. We've picked this age up here to consider people full legal adults because on some level we expect them to be fully mature moral adults. And that's what the journey of adolescence is supposed to produce. It's not about physical maturity. It's not about legal maturity. It is about moral maturity. Now, what does moral maturity mean? This is how I'm going to suggest it to you. I want you to think about moral maturity as kind of equivalent to wisdom. Wisdom is a combination of a couple things. One is knowledge, right? So Moses says they didn't know. They didn't know the difference between good and evil. Okay? You have to be able to tell the difference between what is good and what is evil, what is good and what is bad, what is true and what is false, and that is a process. There are lots of studies that would suggest that young children have an intuitive moral sense, moral compass. And you all know this, you've been around little kids. They know fairness, they know fair play, they're able to say good, bad, right, and wrong. They're not able to account for the complexities of adult life. You get into your teenage years and it's not so easy anymore. Sometimes laws and rules conflict with each other, and you've got to have value sets that allow you to figure out, why should I obey this one at this moment and not obey that one? Things get a little more complicated. People need a period of life to work through that. It's not intuitive. It takes training and help. So they need to be able to tell the difference. How do I know what is good and what is bad? That's part of wisdom. It's part of moral maturity. But the second part, and this is even more important, is once you know the difference, because it's not just about knowing. You can have an evil person who knows the difference between good and evil. Right? What's the cliche? It just makes them a clever devil. I mean, it doesn't help them. Wisdom isn't just knowing something. It's knowledge applied in a specific way. Right? Wisdom is not just knowing the difference between good and evil. It is wanting the good and having the moral character to choose it. I want you to think about the period of adolescence as a moral maturation process, where when you get to the end of it, you ought to know the difference between what is good and what is bad, one. But when you look at what is good, you ought to want it for yourself, for your own reasons, for your life, that you have chosen for yourself, that your life is going to be about the good, doing the good, no matter what it costs you. That is moral maturity. The reason an ancient Israelite was held accountable for religious law at 20 was because in their culture, the expectation was by the time you got there, chronologically, you had been trained. You knew the difference between good and evil, and you were supposed to have chosen it for yourself. You were supposed to have committed your life, your identity, that what I am going to be about in this world is giving my life wholly to the good, no matter what it costs me. And if you didn't do that, if you didn't choose that, you were obviously held accountable for not choosing it. So when we talk about adolescence as to mature, a process of going from childhood to adulthood, we know when it starts. When it ends is not when your culture has arbitrarily decided to call you a legal adult. It's when you have become a moral adult, that you are someone who knows the good, you love the good, and you choose the good. Now, we don't have a scene from Jesus' life during his adolescent years. This is one of those windows in his life we don't have direct access to. What we do have is we have the story at the temple when he was 12. We looked at that story last week. That would have been the beginning of his adolescent journey. The story I chose for this morning, the miracle at the wedding feast in Cana, I chose it for a couple reasons. One, John, who reports the story, says that this was the first time Jesus revealed his glory. This was Jesus' coming out party from John's perspective. He had already started his public ministry. He'd already gathered some disciples. But in terms of like outing himself to the world, the wedding was when that happened. So that's a big deal. This is a crossing over a threshold moment for Jesus. He's stepping into public life and public scrutiny. This is when he does it. And the story pivots on a choice about doing something that is good. And so I see a connection between these two stories. Now, this is a well-known gospel story. If you have any experience in church, you've probably heard this story many, many times. It's one of the more popular ones in the Gospels. Jesus and his mother Mary are invited to a wedding feast. Because Jesus had already begun his career as an itinerant rabbi, he's got a few disciples. They get to come along because that's how weddings in their traditional culture worked. Everybody was invited. It was a whole town affair. And the family of the bride was expected to provide for everybody for as long as the festivities lasted, which could go for a week or more. Earlier this year, Carrie and I were out west in Vancouver. We got to participate in a wedding as part of a traditional Indian culture, a culture that probably very similar to Jesus's. The festivities lasted multiple days. I could not believe what the family of the bride did, how much they had to do and how many people they had to provide for. It was incredible. It was like, as part of this culture, if anybody gets engaged, it's going to end up being like a 2-week obligation for you to go and be a part of it. There's a party every single day. And every single day, you're eating butter chicken and naan, and it's amazing. But it's all these things. I couldn't believe it. Okay? That was what you were expected to do in a traditional culture like Jesus's. So, if you've heard this story before, a point that is often made is it would be something of a social faux pas or an embarrassment if you ran out of something, if you couldn't provide. Okay? Obviously, the wine runs out at this party. So there's a problem here. This family, right, this is sort of a black eye on their social record, okay? But maybe even more important than that, especially wine. Wine in the Old Testament is metaphorically symbolic of blessing. It's often used in that way to describe God's blessing. So when you run out of wine at a religious wedding festival and you got a bunch of religious people sitting around talking all religiously like religious people do, and they find out that you've run out of wine, you can just imagine some religious people going, guess God cursed this wedding. Okay, these people are probably not going to make it, right? And that's probably going to float around. So there's this sense in which maybe God's blessing isn't on this wedding anymore, isn't on this union. Maybe God's not in this. Okay, that's a problem. It's a problem on multiple levels. Mary's hip to it, right? She's a woman, she's intuitive, she sees it, she's been married, she knows how it goes. She recognizes, okay, this is a problem. And she comes to Jesus and she asks Jesus to do something about it, which means she knew who Jesus was and she knew Jesus could do something about it. And Jesus' response to her indicates that Jesus also knew who he was and could do something about it, and that he knew that she knew, that he knew that she knew. They knew who he was and what he could do. It was one of the great mysteries of Jesus' life is like, when did he figure this out? When did he know that he was different? Was it like a light? Was it like a light switch? Just one day it just came on and he's like, oh my gosh, I'm the Son of God. Well, that means something. Or was it like more of just a slow process of like conversations and experiences where he just began to live into this identity? We don't know. What we do know is that by the time he is a full legal adult, sitting at this wedding, he knows who he is and he knows what he can do. And yet initially he kind of rebuffs her. Right? Why are you troubling me with this? This isn't our problem. Right? My time has not yet come. Jesus knows who he is and he knows what he can do. Why does he initially hesitate to do it in this moment? I don't know. I mean, the story doesn't say. So you're going to have to speculate, which I think is part of the fun of reading the Bible. You're going to have to conjecture a little bit. When I look at this story, I go, okay, Jesus is in this moment. He knows who he is. He knows what he can do. He's probably got some vision of how his life is going to play out. Mary knows. He knows. His disciples kind of know. Nobody else knows. At some point, Jesus is going to do something publicly where everybody knows. Maybe he hadn't yet figured out what that was going to be, but he had to have known at some point, I'm going to do something that people are going to see or they're going to hear about, and then they're going to know what I know and what my mom knows. And whenever that day comes, there's no going back. Right now, I know who I am. I know what I'm about. I know what I'm going to live into, but I really haven't stepped into that just yet. But the second I do something publicly, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. And Jesus was certainly intelligent enough and culturally informed enough to know that once he took that step, he knew where it was going to go. He knows the world he lives in. He knows if he starts walking around claiming to be the Messiah and performing miracles, he knows he's going to make certain people angry, and he knows where it's going to end up. He's watched this happen before to other people. So he knows. Is it possible that in that moment, with all of that looming, is it possible that Jesus just thinks to himself, I'm just not sure the wedding is worth it? I mean, nobody's dying. I mean, wine? I mean, I get it, but okay, so some people are going to think God has cursed their union. That's not true. I mean, is now the best time for me to do this? Is this the moment where I'm going to finally step into the public and there's no going back? Is this really the right thing to do? But Mary insists, and he ends up doing it. So what happened? What changed? What changed in his mind that he goes from initially, I don't think I should, I don't want to doing it. And I don't think it was just like, well, can't say no to mom. What happened in him in this moment that he decides, okay, I wasn't sure, now I am, and I'm doing it. And I'm embracing everything that comes with it. I try to put myself in, as impossible as I try to put myself in Mary's shoes. I try to imagine what it'd like to be Jesus' mother. So I see a connection here between the temple episode when he was 12 and this story right here. Right? If you remember that story from last week, Jesus seems to think when he's 12 that his time has come. Right? He sticks around at the temple. He's got some important things to do. It's probably his mom, not to like rob him of life or, but it's probably his mom who says to 12-year-old Jesus, bud, it's not your time yet. It's not your time. You're not ready. You got to come home. You got some learning to do. You're not there yet. And Jesus listens to her and he goes home. Now you're much further down the road and the roles are reversed. Jesus is the one saying, my time hasn't come, and it's his mother who's saying, yes, it has. And he listens to her again. And I just look at these two stories and I think about the decision in front of Jesus. What's the decision? It's just to do what's good and right. These people are struggling. They're hurting. They're going to suffer something. You alone can do something about it, and you're here right now. So you should. I imagine Jesus learning this from Mary as a teenager. I imagine her being the one telling him over and over and over and over and over again, God is our helper. God is someone who helps us always, in big and small. That's who God is, and that's who we're supposed to be. If you have the opportunity to help, you do it. That's what's good and right, because that's who God is. That's what God does. I imagine Jesus getting that lesson over and over again every dinner. Yes, Mom, I know. Yes, God helps us. I got it. I'm supposed to help people. I got it. And now here he is. He has an opportunity to help people. Nobody's dying. Nobody's life is going to be ruined. But they're going to suffer. There's going to be consequences. Jesus can do something about it. And it's Mary who's saying, now's the time. What better time? What better time than right now? What better way to communicate to the world that God helps us? And that God's help is in all things, big and small, and it's totally gratuitous. It's just a gift. What better way to communicate that to the world? Make some wine. Let the party keep going. Save these people. I can't think of any better way than right now to do this. And Jesus does it. And this kind of gratuitous do-gooding, it like became a trademark of Jesus' ministry. It's the thing that got him in trouble. In Jewish law, in Jesus' day, you couldn't work on the Sabbath. Most people know that. On their seventh day, you could do no work. It was part of their law. What you could do is if a person's life was in jeopardy, because Jews felt that life was sacred, if a person's life was in jeopardy, you could work to save them. So you could violate Sabbath law for work in order to rescue someone whose life was in jeopardy. But Jesus often healed people on the Sabbath when their lives were not in jeopardy. A man with dropsy, a crippled woman, the blind, lepers, the lame. And there are multiple scenes where some religious leader says to the crowd, right? Jesus heals somebody on a Sabbath, and then some religious leader gets up and says, wait a minute. There are 6 days for you to do your work. Let people come on one of those days to be healed, but not on the Sabbath day. And Jesus would respond either with a statement or a question. He would say, tell me, is it lawful to do what is good or not? Does someone's life have to be in jeopardy in order for God to want to help them? And Jesus would heal them. Someone's life didn't have to be in jeopardy. It could be something like wine. Just the gratuitous gift of love and blessing that would become a trademark of Jesus' ministry. I think he learned it as a teenager. I think during his teenage years was when he fully committed himself. He began to understand what is good and what is not good, what God actually cares about and what God doesn't give a rip about. God could not care less that you are wearing clothing with two different types of fabric. He very much cares about his daughter who is crippled. God could not care less that you didn't wash your hands before eating out of that pot. He cares very much about his blind son. He figured out who God is, what God cares about, and he committed himself to that life, no matter what it costs. He fully stepped in to that adult identity of life is about knowing what is good, loving what is good, and choosing what is good. You know, adolescence for us is still a season of transition. It's still a season of growing up. I just wonder if for many of us, it's about this kind of growing up. I mean, if you're a teenager, if you're in this life right now, you ask yourselves the question, what do you care most about? Do you care most about how you are performing? What kind of grades you're getting? How well known you are? How good looking you are? How many friends you have? What you're going to do after high school? What job you're going to do? How much money you're going to make? Where you're going to live? Are those the things that are preoccupying your mind and your attention and your care? Rather than, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of life do I want to live? Not what I want to do, but how do I want to live? If you're an adult and you're parenting someone in this phase, as I am, or you've parented someone through this phase, what was it about? What was it? Is it about their test scores? Is it about where they're going to go to college? Is it about how well they're going to perform in life or how much money they're going to make? Not on your best days, it's not. On your best days, it's about who they are becoming. At some point, all of us have to decide what life is about. Is life about fame, success, comfort, material prosperity, power, good looks, popularity? Jesus would say no. Life is not about what you have. Life is about who you are. All of us at some point have to decide who we are going to be and how we are going to live in this world. We're either going to get out of bed every morning striving and grinding to build a certain kind of external reality for ourselves, or we're going to get up every day in order to give ourselves wholly and fully to what is good, no matter the cost, because that's what it means to be fully human. I think we get tricked in this world into believing that the first half of our life, which caps at the end of adolescence, that the first half of our life is about building something. And anybody who's past that looks back and goes, man, what was I giving my life to? What was I giving my time to? To grow up into the fullness of humanity, to become fully who we are, is to know the good, to love the good, and to give ourselves to the good, no matter the cost. That's what I see. That's what I see in the post-adolescent life of Jesus. And I think he's somehow carrying us all up into that, even if we're kicking and screaming. But I think he's also just inviting us into that way of being human, Let's be people who know the good, love the good, and make our lives about participating in that, no matter the cost. Well, we're going to finish our service this morning by taking communion together. If you're new here, if this is your first time with us, we take communion together every week. This is the church's sacrament of remembrance. We are remembering that God, who is perfect in love, took on flesh and then broke his body and shed his blood for the people that he loves. We're remembering that. That's who our faith is in. Communion is also a sacrament of participation. When we come forward and we take the bread that represents Jesus' broken body and the juice that represents his shed blood, we are mysteriously entering our life into his life, inviting his life into our life. We are rooting our humanity in his humanity, participating in his way of being human, and being empowered to live that way. Sacraments are a means of grace to transform your life, to spiritually empower you to live differently. If you want to live differently, if you want to live into the good, then the table's open to you. Come, live with Jesus, live with the church. If you've not done this before, in just a second, I'll invite you to stand. I'll dismiss you starting in the back rows. You'll come down the center aisle. Our communion tables are on the sides of our stage here. We invite you to take a prepackaged communion cup back to your seat using the side aisles, and then you can take that during this last song as you feel led. Okay, I invite you to stand. Let me pray for us. God, we confess to you, we are yours. We owe you every ounce of blood in our veins, every breath in our lungs. We belong to you. Forgive us for not always acting that way, for living as if our lives are our own to do with as we please. Reveal to us the good through your Son, Jesus Christ. And by your grace and the power of your Holy Spirit, I pray that you would cultivate in us hearts and souls and wills that love the good that we see and long to do it. Pray that we would become people who participate fully in the good. We love you and we thank you. We surrender ourselves to you. Do a work of grace in us. In Jesus' name, amen.